Well, this is going to be a follow-up video to my last list of libertarian books. YouTube user the Sauce asked that I make more. I have to premise this by saying in that video I said that, you know, you can, if you're a libertarian looking to read, we can divide it into two categories, one being explicitly libertarian books that outline libertarian ideology and philosophy, and then books that aren't necessarily explicitly libertarian. In fact, some books that are actually by anti-libertarians, but that the content of which lends credence directly or indirectly to the libertarian worldview. So a history book, a book about, you know, maybe some type of policy issue. The quintessential book that so a book that outlines libertarian political philosophy would be like For a New Liberty by Rothbard or Libertarianism Today by Jacob Hubert. Those are the two that I recommend the most, although there are several others. A book that's not by a libertarian but covers libertarian material would be the best example would be The Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Kolko. He's some type of leftist. I've heard Marxist, neo-Marxist. He's definitely a socialist, but he very convincingly debunks in that book the idea that the progressive era was an instance of government using regulations to curtail um, the excesses of free market capitalism, when in fact it was used as a rent-seeking regulatory capture measure to destroy competition, to entrench forever certain large businesses. And that is right along the libertarian ideology, and it's lent credence by the fact that it's not by a libertarian, it's by a Marxist. So there's that, but then there's lots of books that are written by people who are basically indifferent to libertarianism, and some are even by conservatives. So in the books I'm going to list here, most of them are not strictly libertarian books. In fact, I think only a few of them are. But I find them all interesting and rewarding, and they speak a lot about issues that are very pertinent both to libertarianism, but by extension to today. So the first one I want to mention is one I couldn't mention the last time, and that is The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky. And one, don't be dissuaded, it says recommended by Newt Gingrich right there. Don't be dissuaded by that. Marvin Olasky appears to be a religious Christian. I think he's probably a conservative. But this is a great book. I just started reading this, and it's really good. It's on par with Charles Murray's Losing Ground, about welfare and how government just cannot do it. How government makes it worse, basically, and how the causes of poverty are pretty complex and aren't being addressed by a federal bureaucracy, or any bureaucracy for that matter, geared towards alleviating it. And it's actually pretty clear if you read this that it's unlikely that the main motive for the federal bureaucracy is actually to stop poverty. It's just to create a new interest group to support politicians. So this is definitely a recommended book. This book, The First Armies by Doyne Dawson. This gives a lot of good early history about the first states. Look on the back here, we got the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, the Indus River Valley, the Nile River Valley. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. One thing you do learn, though, is that the idea that militaries arise to defend the populace is just silly. They arise to aggrandize materially the rulers of city-states. Basically, they come to an agreement, you be my army, then I'll give you a living, and in return you keep me in power against my own subjects and international rivals. This also has some interesting stuff vis-a-vis stateless versus non-state militaries, and I've referenced this before, how there's a photograph in here of the Apache, and it's juxtaposing how effective the Apache were. You know, even though they were Stone Age, yet they were able to basically withstand the United States government in the 1880s, at a point when the United States government was, well, the United States was the richest industrial society in history by that point. So that's interesting. I think I may have mentioned this one before, Viking Age Iceland. Iceland, a lot of libertarians have heard about it as like this stateless society, free market society. I think free market's not correct, but stateless definitely. This is definitely a stateless society. And one of the things that people really have a hard time understanding is, well, if you don't have a state, then you can't have law. But this is a society that not only there's no question did not have a state, there's also no question that it was a very litigious society. There was law. In fact, a famous traveler from Baden, a monk from Baden, Germany, said in Iceland, there is no king but the law. It was a very, very organized society, and there is actually some evidence that our legal traditions are influenced by these. But this is a good history book. There's a famous David D. Friedman article that covers this period, but his only reference is this book. So if you read this book, you will be very knowledgeable about the so-called Icelandic Commonwealth, much more so than the average person you're likely to meet. It's pretty small book, pretty easy to find on Amazon. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely read it. And I don't know that there's an equivalent to the anarchic societies of Ireland. I read about them in other books that are, about England or some other country that reference them, but I don't know if there's a really good one that covers that topic. But there is one for Iceland, so definitely. This is kind of a controversial figure because he's not super popular at the Mises Institute. It's by George Selgin, Good Money. This is about the private production of coinage. Basically, that privately produced coins are of higher quality and more desirable to consumers than are government-produced coins. These are historical examples. This isn't his philosophizing. He is not a Rothbardian. He's a free banker. But I actually learned about this book because he did give a lecture at Mises Institute maybe 2 or 3 years ago about this book. But definitely a good read. This is basically empirical evidence to the viability of competing currencies. So this guy is kind of reviled as a racist, antebellum villain. John C. Calhoun, A Disquisition on Government. Rothbard cites this book. Basically, he comes to the conclusion that government can never be equal in any way because you're always going to have net tax receivers versus net tax payers. So even if a government employee pays 20% taxes, really all of their salary comes from taxes. So they're basically just figure out 80% of their salary at what their take home after taxes, and that's positive. That's what they're getting. And so he basically argues, look, you're always going to have as long as you have government, you're going to have a class of people, an interest group that has an interest in expanding the role of government. There's no way to make it fair. There's no fair taxation where everyone pays the same or receives the same benefits. It's just not possible. Even though I don't accept egalitarianism, there is no way that any government that is based on taxation can ever meet egalitarian standards, ever. Not that Calhoun was egalitarian. He thought that you needed a government, but he just thought you should be honest about what that implies. We shouldn't pretend that it's something that it's not. It's a short book. People in the 19th century Americans, especially the political class, were quite a bit smarter than we are today, which reading books like this makes pretty evident. So it is actually kind of difficult, but very lucid, and it's not long, so I'd recommend it. Tom DeLorenzo recommends this book quite a bit too. Straight Shooting by John Lott. This is about media bias against gun control, or against gun use for gun control. He basically empirically shows they are biased. Taliban. This is the definitive work on the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's always good to know as much as you can about our current conflicts and how the Taliban is not the same thing as Al-Qaeda, which is not the same thing as Iran, which is not the same thing as Saudi Arabia, which is not the same thing as 9/11. This came highly recommended, so definitely. It's by a Pakistani journalist, so it's not that big, not that expensive. It's not super long, so I think we should be as well informed about. I mean, yeah, we should read books about Viking Age Iceland, but we should know about contemporary society as well. And if we can be articulate about the wars that we're fighting in currently, so much the better. So books like this are pretty indispensable, and I have a couple other ones that are going to be like this in this listing. I already mentioned Gabriel Kolko about The Triumph of Conservatism, which is a must-read. This is his other book, Railroads and Regulation. Basically, 1916 was the end of railroads as a market institution. They are basically a fascist institution ever since then. They're privately owned nominally, although there have been periods when they were completely nationalized, including in 1917. But they've had wage rates, freight rates have been set by the government now for almost 100 years. And that's why Amtrak and the railroads is a non-dynamic, stupid, disgusting, horrible industry. But this goes back more into, it's pretty short. It's the only book really about this. People write books about the railroads, but the interplay of government and free market is just something that goes over most people's heads. It's kind of taken a given. If there's government intervention, it's just kind of assumed that that's the way it always was or the way it's supposed to be, even though it obviously wasn't. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of literature that examines that dynamic, not just for railroads, but for anything. And Kolko, he's got this and he's got The Triumph of Conservatism, which are basically among the very best books on that topic. The only other ones that are comparable would be some of the Austrians, and maybe some of the other free market guys too, but definitely worth a read. National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union by Anthony C. Sutton. I'm going to talk about some of his other books later. I've mentioned his books before. He's a British economist. He worked at the Hoover Institute, the place where Thomas Sowell is based. And he got a lot of notoriety for this book because during the Vietnam War, a lot of American fighter pilots were saying that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were driving what they described as American, even Ford trucks, which they thought was very odd. And when it turned out these trucks were being built at the Gorky plant in the Soviet Union, and that the Gorky plant is a copy of the River Rouge plant that Henry Ford built in Dearborn, Michigan, and that the Soviets basically had our technology, and they didn't steal it. We gave it to them. And this is kind of a brief expose about that. And he called it national suicide because we're fighting an enemy that is being equipped essentially directly or indirectly by us. So this book is his most famous work, although I don't think it's his most important, but very interesting. The Mask of Merlin. If you don't recognize this fellow on the front, GS Debunked, you should know who this is. Well, it says in the top. It's a critical biography of David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of England during the First World War. This is a good book about the corruption, the political corruption that took place in the UK during World War I. There was all kinds of militarism back then. The bloodshed of the First World War. People have a very negative view of it these days, which is good. I wish the people would have a similar reservations about World War II. They don't, but this goes into some of the details. And there are also some very interesting other allusions. I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but this is a good book. It covers his. You also learn about the political machine in early 20th century Great Britain, late 19th century Great Britain. And also interesting is David Lloyd George is somebody who got his political start as being a pacifist. When he was first getting started, the Boer War was going on, and he was a critic about it. He said it was, bloodshed and whatever. And then he ended up becoming this, one of the great butchers of history, basically. Which, of course, it's analogous to an extent with our current president, I would say. So you learn a lot about a period in history that most people don't know very much about. I certainly didn't prior to reading this book, so good luck finding it. By Donald McCormick. He's wearing druidic garb here. He's from Wales. He liked to pretend that. There's probably lots of these you can get. I just found this looking on my bookshelf just now. I don't even remember buying it. I might have gotten it for free somewhere. It's a selected works of Frederick Bastiat. I have his complete works someplace. These are a lot thinner. And the forward here is by Hayek. Brian Kaplan just posted something really interesting about Bastiat. Basically, he demolishes the most simplistic arguments for socialism, for big government, which Kaplan says, well, there are more sophisticated arguments in favor of things like minimum wage, but people don't become enamored with socialism because of those more sophisticated ones. They become more enamored in ones that basically are demolished by the broken window fallacy, something that he did so much to annihilate. So We should all read as much Bastiat as we can. The Law is probably his most famous book, but these are some of his other economic writings. The Tariff History of the United States by Frank William Taussig. This book was actually written in the 1880s. So if you read this book, it means tariff history up through the 1880s, because he didn't write it since then. This is actually, I believe, this is where they actually took the original type and just reproduced it. So the font is like what you would have in a printing press, not from modern printing styles. I have a couple of books like that. But this goes into the history when we had tariffs, when we didn't. Alexander Hamilton was in favor of tariffs. We actually didn't really have any tariffs until the War of 1812. And then they were instituted as a war measure that never went away. And tariffs had a big part to play in the lead up to the Civil War, just like slavery did. I'm not going to say that they're the cause and slavery isn't, but they were very influential. And it did retard the economic growth of this country to have agriculturalists spend more on money, spend more on their on basically inferior goods, because there were tariffs on cheaper, higher quality imports, especially from Europe, especially Great Britain. But this goes through all the various incarnations, the various tariff of abomination, all through, and eventually most of this stuff did get repealed in the real free trade area in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But then, of course, they all got undone by the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This does not cover that because this is written 130 years ago. But definitely, I mean, you'll know more about the tariff history of the United States than anybody you'll likely meet. Imperial Life in the Emerald City by Rajiv Chandrasekaran. This is a book about the American imperial presence or administration of Iraq after the Iraq War. This is not a history of the war itself, just how it was administered. This is disgusting reading. Clearly, I mean, you have cases where clearly qualified people are turned down because someone else is a famous Republican's nephew or whatever, and they're playing fast and loose, and like hundreds of thousands of people die or are impoverished because of it. So this is a good book about this. It's about, of course, the corporatism, about all the contractors who live basically the high life on government dime. So yeah, this is a good book. I think this was recommended to me by a fellow by the name of Roman Skaskew, who is a Hoppian. He's an anarcho-capitalist, but he was deployed to Afghanistan once, in Iraq twice, or a total of 3 times. I don't remember which one was 2 and which one was 1. Since became a Libertarian Ron Paul supporter, he recommends this book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So learn a little bit about our imperial escapades. Here's a short little classic, The People's Pottage by Garrett Garrett. I don't know if his name is pronounced the same. See, this is a very small book. This guy is the old right / the embryonic libertarian movement. This guy with John T. Flynn and a few others, he's very similar to, say, H.L. Mencken or Knock. Garrett Garrett, he eventually, became a recluse and died in a cave. But this is about the birth of the American Empire. This is written in the early 50s. He died in the mid 50s. And this is about the abrogation just the complete obliteration of any kind of Republican principle. Not that I'm a Republican, but just to a totalitarian chief executive state, an imperial presidency. And he talks about one famous phrase from this book is the idea that in an imperial power you have amazing fear and vaunting. So the idea is that on the one hand, you're always being bellicose about how tough you are and how you're going to grandstand about how great you are, but then you're terrified of every little thing. And I think this is clearly the case in America now, where you've got all this jingoism, and yet at the same time people are fretting that the underwear bomber, which even if those threats were exactly as dangerous as listed, that's nothing to be worried about. Car accidents are far more deadly, and we see this, of course, with gun control also. Oh no, I'm afraid to go to a theater now. When millions of people went to the theater, nothing happened. This is definitely a person's very pessimistic writing. This is a guy who's seeing the destruction of liberty in this country and seeing that it's happening without there being any kind of backlash. This is in 3 little parts. I've known about this book for years. It took me a while before I actually read it, but it is definitely worth it. It's a classic. It's kind of sad, but it is also this old American liberalism in the libertarian sense that was defeated basically by World War II and the Great Depression and the New Deal. I mean, these people were basically completely disenfranchised. Most of them lost their jobs and everything. A few of them didn't, like Henry Hazlitt, and I mean, they politically they were destroyed by the Eisenhower era. And Ron Paul is kind of like the regeneration, the phoenix of this political philosophy. So this is definitely worth reading. Oh, another one, I just mentioned him, John T. Flynn, As We Go Marching. This is about World War II from a contemporary critic of Roosevelt. His other famous book is The Roosevelt Myth. This was actually pretty hard to find. This is also fairly expensive too. But it's about the destruction of our liberty in the name of World War II, and it's a contemporary book. And I think World War II is the founding. We have 2 competing civic religions in the United States, and one of them is the Bill of Rights, founding fathers, liberty, all that, and the other one is the government is this amazing force for good and positive change in the world and within society, epitomized by FDR in World War II. And those are mutually exclusive worldviews. They can't both be true. And both are accorded respect, thankfully. At least, you know, the earlier one, which of course is not perfect, but is, I would say, a different monster altogether than what FDR represents. And this is one of those voices of someone who's saying, look, this is not good what's happening. This is highly recommended. Lou Rockwell has recommended this many times. I haven't actually read it yet, though. But when I do, I'm sure I'll retroactively support having recommended it. So, The Pursuit of Justice by Edward Lopez. This is put out by the Independent Institute, which is where Robert Higgs is based. This is basically empirical studies that show that the legal system in the United States, or any legal system that's monopolized by a state, becomes either overtly or indirectly tailored to serve the interests of the states at the expense of everybody else. It's several articles basically going through all that. Highly recommend this book. Goes into the history, goes into empirical reasons why we know that, and it's a little dry, but it's worth reading. It's not that long either. So. The Territorial Imperative, a personal inquiry into animal origins of property and nations. Basically, this is similar to Butler Schaeffer's work, that property is basically a necessary evolutionary process, that it's not some abstract ideological thing. It's something that we actually have. It's natural. It's biological. This book is from the 70s, I believe. All of this particular copy is a later edition. Again, I haven't read this one, but it's supposed to be really good. So, Robert Audrey. I already mentioned it, but this is what it looks like. This is a must-read. This is up there with Higgs's books. So, read this at work just before I came back. Bureaucracy by Mises. Notice it's pretty thin. It's about 100 pages. He is actually a minarchist, and so he defends minarchy. You know, but he describes how bureaucracy works and how it does not satisfy the desires of consumers and why it can't. Very pithy stuff. You just have to read Mises with a notepad to write down a lot of the quotes he puts down. I say you have to do that because I never have, and it would be good to do. And it's from the Mises Institute, so it had its own bookmark, and I don't know. This is good, definitely worth reading. The Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein he's a leftist. I think he's actually an anarcho-syndicalist. I haven't actually heard him say that, but people have told me that. He always has earned my respect. There's a video of him giving a lecture about the Holocaust, and somebody basically tries to be politically correct, says he shouldn't talk about Germans and Jews because it's offensive, and he tells that bitch to stop crying crocodile tears. It's a great little clip if you can find it on YouTube. This I think is second or third book of his I've read. It's very good. This one's about the Holocaust industry. It's a very interesting history of how Jews in America have viewed the state of Israel and the Holocaust. And there has been a radical change in how both of those are viewed by American Jews and the American public generally. Holocaust is not a big deal until after the 1967 Six-Day War that Israel won. Prior to that, the Holocaust was not something people tended to talk about, and most American Jews tended to stress being American rather than have it appear that they had divided loyalties by stressing the importance of Israel. Israel is a very leftist, socialist kind of state. It's mostly the people who established it, especially initially, were Eastern Europeans, very communistic, communal. That's what the whole kibbutzim, and a lot of Americans were like, that's just not something we want to be too in favor for. And then eventually that attitude changed to not our benefit. But this is a good history of that, which I wasn't expecting actually. I was thinking this was going to be more about people profiting off of the Holocaust, which is also in here. So Finkelstein has good books, and I recommend listening to him. He's probably not great on economics, but in terms of this, totally he's a pioneer, and he has suffered for it. He lost his teaching position basically for getting in flame wars with violently Zionist pro-Israel Jews. So Thomas Sowell, Civil Rights, Rhetorical Reality, just read this one. Very good. It's old, it's from 1983, but it's definitely worth reading. Quite a few books here to go. Good book on the Civil War, Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation. Economics of the Civil War by Mark Thornton. Mark Thornton's at the Mises Institute. This is very brief. It talks about, for how many books are on the Civil War, there's almost none about economics. In fact, this is the only one I've ever actually seen. It goes through how both the North and the South intervened in the economy and how both of their interventions made the war worse for their respective populations. So definitely a good book. The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11 by Lawrence Wright. This is an excellent book. Highly recommend. I've been hearing about reading this for a long time, and then several of the books I read reference this book, so this goes, and this kind of very elaborately talks about why American foreign policy motivated and angered people like Osama bin Laden and people who followed him. I mean, you can't read this and think, oh, they just hate us because we wear blue jeans and are libertine. I mean, if that was the case, they'd attack Sweden. So highly recommend. Looks like winner of the Pulitzer Prize. I don't know how much that matters to anybody, but I found this book very engrossing. It's a very easy read. You should definitely combine this with a couple others. The Odyssey of Pat Tillman, Ghost Wars, Imperial Life in the Emerald City, and one or two other ones I'm going to talk about in a minute. But Radical Islam and the War on Terror is something I think that we should be pretty conversant about, and this would be a good first step. So I think I already mentioned this one, but John Lott again, More Guns, Less Crime. It's a classic. The Wages of Destruction, the making and breaking of the Nazi economy. Basically, that the Nazi Germany was not some economic powerhouse, that all the Autobahn building and central planning that's so lauded was horribly destructive. This is not by a free market person, by the way. This is just a historian, and that part of the reason they actually went to war was a vain, wrong-headed attempt to stem economic collapse in Germany. And if you read Mises, he talks, if you're a nationalist, you have to believe in autarky. You have to look at, if you're a nationalist in Germany, you have to say, okay, the fact that we don't have oil is a problem. We can't buy it, even though that makes the most sense and that's far cheaper and more sensible. We need to conquer it. And so this is one of the revisionist books. It's been out for probably 10 years now, but basically that Germany wasn't this all-powerful state, that it was a major power in Central Europe, but it had bitten off way more than it could chew, and it was dealing from a position of weakness, not of strength. So definitely a good book. This is an interesting one. Foundations of the American Century. The Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller Foundations in the Rise of the American Power. This is about the so-called NGOs, non-government organizations that have used their think tank power to influence public policy in the United States. Not just public policy, but just the society generally. And these are, interestingly, Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, not so much with Ford, but with Carnegie and Rockefeller, these are kind of like the arch capitalists, right? But what do their think tanks advocate? They advocate world socialism. In fact, Carnegie explicitly thought the Soviet Union was the way to go, and how can they change the view of Americans to become socialists? And interestingly enough, they concluded, after thinking about this for more than a year, that it would be impossible to just slowly convince them, but we would need big, earth-shattering, iconoclastic events, most importantly, war. And it's not a coincidence. This isn't to say that they caused, say, World War I or World War II, but they saw them as opportunities to advance what we would call a socialist or a fascist agenda on the American populace. And these are the kind of institutes that, okay, maybe the average American wasn't reading, but Woodrow Wilson was, and Theodore Roosevelt was, and Franklin Roosevelt was, and their advisors, and Wendell Willkie, and everybody on their cabinet. So, very, very important book. Very, very. I think I heard about this from Scott Horton. Definitely, definitely. The Davidian Massacre by Carol Moore. The Massacre of the Branch Davidians is what got me initially thinking about the role of government in society. Before this, I thought of it as a panacea, something that would solve problems. At this point, because of this event, I began to question that, realizing that at least in some situations, it could be very bad. And this is kind of like a definitive work on that event. It's pretty cheap because it was mass printed, so you could probably get it for like $1 on Amazon. It's absolutely just gut-wrenching reading, but it shows the pathology of the government, especially the agencies like the ATF and the FBI, and the chief executive, in this case Bill Clinton, Janet Reno. And I mean, this is worse than this whole Anwar al-Awlaki thing, because these people, David Kress was charged with very, very minor crimes. None of the other Davidians were, and they were all murdered on TV, no less. So this, I don't want to say it's a good book, but it's something that you should read. In the 40s, all the main libertarians in the United States were women, and most people today remember Ayn Rand, but there was also Isabel Patterson. This is The God and the Machine, her great work from 1944, 43. I don't remember. But she was emulated and copied to a large extent by Rand and even by Rothbard. So this is a classic. This is one of those books. It's kind of a tide over from the old classical liberalism to the new libertarianism. This is at the nexus of the two. One of the I mean, we're talking about a horrible period in the history of liberty in the world in the 1940s, and this is one of those few things. This is maybe like The Road to Serfdom, one or two others, that kind of connect the two ideological here. This is, like Mises is a physical person who connects the two. This is a book that connects the two. But yeah, she was definitely, I think Isabel Patterson was a book reviewer for a long time. I might be remembering that wrong. But the classic work, The God of the Machine. The New Deal in Old Rome. This is written during the Depression, and it was comparing the policies of FDR to those of Old Rome, especially the policies of Diocletian. Basically about inflation, setting wage and price controls, and look how well it worked for the Roman Empire. I'm sure it's going to work out fine in the American Empire. Good book. Boston Tea Parties, You and the Police. This is a fun book. It's short. It's basically how to handle yourself in police encounters, at least if you want to be a libertarian ubermensch, which we all aspire to be. I know I do. The only problem I have with this is it's very hard to practice dealing with the police unless you're constantly getting pulled over, which is my philosophy to avoid. But this tells you how to act. It's not just knowing your rights, but just knowing the situation. This is from a guy who understands that, you know, they're not likely to um, necessarily respect your rights, but you should still know them, be able to articulate them. Boston's writing's always entertaining, always informative, and this is just a brief little book, but I guarantee if you buy this, it's very likely, I don't guarantee, but it's very likely that you'll read the whole thing without putting it down. So, See No Evil by Robert Baer, B-A-E-R. This is the inspiration to the movie, it's a George Clooney movie, Syriana Polaris. I forget what the name of the movie was, but he's a CIA agent who went around murdering people for the CIA and trying to overthrow governments or whatever. So this is his story. It's, again, he's not a libertarian, but it's just you learn about all the shenanigans they're up to, and what it has to do with our security is basically nothing. New York Times bestseller. I heard about this from Stanley Monteith on Liberty Radio, whatever. Good book. It's easy to read. I think I read it in a day or two. Not an easy read. Pieces of 8, The Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the United States Constitution by Edward Vieira Jr. This book is considered the absolute definitive work on what the Constitution says about what is and is not money. Edward Vieira is like 4 doctorates in like law, chemistry, physics, and I don't know, something like economics or something. He went to Harvard for all of them. And when Ron Paul was having presentations, hearings at the Fed about monetary policy, he had Edward Vieira come and speak on it. And this is just considered that there's no other books like it. It's very hard to come by. It was one of those books that they did a limited printing. A lot of people, there were much more demand than there was books. They all got eaten up. And then Edward Vieira does believe in intellectual property, so he's been really skimpy about giving out more. There was a brief time where he was saying if you paid him $125 and he got like 1,000 people to do it, then he'd print another edition. But basically, I had to shell out a lot of money for this. And I thought there were 2 parts, but it looks like there's only one. But Pieces of 8 is a reference to dividing up the Spanish dollars into 8 little pieces. So, not that I'm a constitutionalist, but it is interesting to see what's supposedly legal and what they actually do. Devil's Game, How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam by Robert Dreyfus. This is a good book that goes with like The Looming Tower and a couple other books about our involvement in the Middle East. Basically, before the 6-Day War, the Americans were very eager to subsidize radical Islam, basically to stem communism and Arab nationalism. So, if they were afraid the communists were going to take over a country, they were more than willing to help, say, the Muslim Brotherhood. Or if they were against, say, someone like Nasser, who was a National Socialist leader of Egypt, they would support, again, the Muslim Brotherhood or Abu Sayyaf or whoever, without any qualms whatsoever. And then later they kind of changed their mind. But good book, also not by a capitalist at all. In fact, he says that Islam is free market, which whatever. But good book. Butler Schaefer's book, In Restraint of Trade, Business Campaign Against Competition. So this is a good companion to Kolko's book. The Enterprise of Law, Justice Without the State by Bruce Benson. Someone chided me for not talking about this book in the last video I did. I had the book then. I still haven't read it, but this is supposedly a very good one. So, The Rise and Decline of the State by Martin Van Cleaver. This is one I just got in the mail when I was away. This is talking about early modern states. The State by Anthony DeJasay. That's Dejasay. This was recommended by Robert Higgs in his last lecture at the Mises Institute. Supposedly it's really good. I'll just reference everyone. Go on the Mises Media webpage, find the most recent lecture by Robert Higgs, which is only like a month old. It was an amazing lecture. He referenced a couple books, and I think I bought all of them. So this is one of them. The State Against Blacks by Walter Williams. This is not about affirmative action. This is about regulations and licensure being used to put black, aka poor people, out of business. Basically, oh, you want to build a house? Well, you need to get a license. You don't have one? Well, we're not going to give one to you because you're black. So, great book. This was hard to find. Apparently, it was fairly popular whenever it came out. He did a documentary on PBS basically about this. I forget what it was called. If you can find it, it used to be on YouTube, but it got pulled down a couple times and then pulled back up. And if you can find it, it's definitely worth watching. It's from the early '80s, as is this book. But great book. Another Higgs recommendation, The State by Franz Oppenheimer. This was written in 1909. This is an English translation from 1913. And his kind of big thing he's famous for is making the distinction that there's two ways people can obtain goods, the political means or the economic means. I think that's how he says it. Economic is you exchange, a mutual exchange. Political is you steal. So this guy, I don't know if he's really libertarian or not, but he viewed the state in those terms. So this is a classic. Don't know why they'd have pictures of Utah sandstone on the front, but they do. So I'm not going to complain. The Ultimate Resource 2 by Julian Simon. I'm sorry to say Julian Simon is dead. You can find a YouTube interview of his. It's fairly lengthy, about an hour. Basically, that human beings are the most important resource in the economy, that overpopulation is not a problem because humans actively resolve issues, make things better. He is also really important in saying, hey, we're not really running out of resources. Yes, we're consuming resources even if others aren't being created, but we're utilizing them in more and more efficient ways. And so even though there's more people than there's ever been, and we've consumed a certain percentage, it depends on which one, of resources, there's still more available to the average person than there ever has been. Big book, but I'm looking forward to reading it. But look up, if you don't want to read it, just type Julian Simon, and there's a couple interviews with him, and they're very good. Seems like a very nice man, and I wish he'd made it a little bit more into the internet age. I mean, he did, but I think he left the scene too early. And then another one recommended by Higgs, which again, we should go watch that, is The Law and Revolution. It's in 2 parts. This is about how the Protestant Reformation, what effect it had on the law. These look really good. I can't wait to read these, but I have to because I'm reading other books instead. So, and then I referenced him earlier. I've talked about these books before, but we've got Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. Now, this is a 3-volume work. It was published back in the 70s. People bought up all the copies and they never published it again. And it's just super hard to find. And I've been trying to get the whole set for almost 10 years now. And sometimes on Amazon, a single volume would be $1,500. So I got volume 1 almost 10 years ago. This is that. And I've read this one. And then a few years later, I got volume 2, 1930 to 1945. So this covers Lend-Lease. And let's see. And I could not find volume 3, and so I had a friend of mine who had still going to school do a book swap. I don't even know where the book came from, and I photocopied volume 3. But when I was at work last time, it's on Amazon for $70. So here's volume 3, 1945 to 1965. So it was kind of like I felt like I had all 3 members of the Triforce. Good luck finding these. Like I said, it's taken me almost 10 years, and all told, probably close to Well, not too bad. I'd say $280 for all three of them. Um, but it, there's an interesting phenomenon with books like this that they get published sometimes, and it's a kind of book that does not seem like it would have a big audience like Western technology and Soviet economic development, and then they're so iconoclastic and important that so many people go and buy them that they sell out, and then for usually somewhat mysterious reasons they never get republished. And so the demand remains very high. It even grows, but the supply continually shrinks. And so the price goes through the roof. And the most notable example of this is the book by Carol Quigley titled Tragedy and Hope. There's a very, very interesting story there that's actually related in Creature from Jekyll Island by G.O. Griffith. Basically, Quigley is he's a elite person. He believes the government. He believes in the Plato philosopher kings, that they should rule over us. He doesn't believe in liberty at all. He's also Bill Clinton's most influential professor, according to Bill Clinton, at Georgetown. And he thought that there was a group of power elites in the United States and England who were trying to bring about basically a new world order, And he thought that the only problem with them is that they should just be open about it. They should say, hey, we're trying to help everybody, and this is how we're going to do it. And he wrote a book about it called Tragedy and Hope, which would be a pretty much unknown book because he wasn't like a famous author or anything. But the John Birch Society found out about this book, and they basically wrote letters to all their people in the John Birch Society recommending that people read it. And of course, they all went out and bought it, and they started, talking about it, what he was saying in their newsletters. This is way back in the 60s or 70s. And Quigley thought, well, there's a demand for my book. And so he went back to the publisher and said, well, I'd like to do another printing. If we're going to sell out, we might as well. And they said that the prints that they had used to make the book had been destroyed or lost, which is very, very unusual. And then he said, well, we'll just make new prints. They said, no, we're not going to do that. Basically, they said, under no circumstances will we publish this book again. And so the implication is that somebody didn't want people to be reading this book. And this is just now changed. Someone else somehow got the rights, and they're selling a pocket version. But if you looked just a year ago, that book would have been easily $80, $100. And now I haven't actually bought it. No, my uncle had a copy of it. But this book is similar to that in that it's like repressed. Anthony C. Sutton wrote several other books about Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, and he's someone who apparently was very much interested in this Anglo-American establishment. And he basically went into hiding. I mean, not hiding, but he stopped publishing. And there's an interview with him. You can look up on YouTube, type Anthony C. Sutton. He was interviewed by Stanley Monteith. And then he died in 2002 or 2000, I don't remember. But he stopped talking about these issues, really. He stopped talking about anything. And Stanley Monteith, who's the host of a radio show, who also recommends many books, and I've read every book I've ever read that he recommended has been worth it. He said he basically would travel the country going to old bookstores trying to find these rare books, and eventually he would. Now we have the internet, but even then, this was hard to find. But I recommend anyone who can find them to get these and to read them. And if you don't have any money, I guess you won't be able to do that. Maybe you can just go to libraries and photocopy them. I've done that, and it's a cheap way to get the information. But anyway, again, this is only a tiny, tiny list of potential books. I mean, I listed one book on the Civil War and one book on World War II, and there are literally hundreds or thousands of pertinent books on those issues. But and now this is going to be like a 50-minute thing. But yeah, and that's not. I mean, there's the rest of the books. There's even more you can't even see in here. So yeah, that's it. I hope that helps the sauce. Anyone who watches the whole thing, give me a shout out and say, hey, I watched the whole thing. And any other book recommendations, I love to hear them too. So if you have one, put it in the comments. All right, that's it.